I guess we'll start. Can everybody hear me okay? Welcome to CIS, I guess, day 1.5, potentially. And I'm really grateful that you've opted to spend your time with me and the rest of the crew here to talk about some of the 4 things that you got to do to get Office 365 and Azure AD right. This is going to be a technical illustration, so that chances mean that something's going to bust. So you're allowed to laugh or mock me at any point when such thing happens. So let's get started a little bit. 78% of our clients are going to migrate or already have migrated to Office 365. Exchange Online is number 1. I mean, who wants to start running, that whole process of running on-premises Exchange servers, right-sizing them, licensing hardware. Our clients are can't run away quickly enough to get to Azure, Exchange Online. And here you take a look. We think 78%. I'm about to get some new numbers next month or so. We think it's going to be probably in the mid-80s. So who here is going to use Office 365 or Exchange Online, or is using it already? Wow. Yeah, that's a healthy size group. All right, last question. Is there anybody here from Microsoft? Well, good. Let's talk about them a little bit, shall we? If there were some Microsoft people here, I was going to have a canned joke like, hey, I left a stone in the back. You can sharpen your knives there for your convenience. But what I'm hoping to do with our time today is to really hit 2 topics. One is talk about the things that we're seeing among our clients and among the things that we've been researching for hybrid cloud identity management with respect to Office 365 and Azure AD. And then finally, I'd like to spend some time talking about some new features that fundamentally change the way that you do cloud identity management for Azure today, and they've just been released in the past 16 weeks. So what you were doing a year ago isn't necessarily the best approach anymore. Here are the 4 things: on-premises preparation, user management, license management, and authentication management. There are many other things we could cover. For example, with Exchange Online, how do you get mail groups from Active Directory in there, and how do you get security-enabled mail lists and so on. I'm not going to be able to touch that, but know that this is something that you would have to tackle as well. So these are the 4 basics. And here you can take a look. Just since really September of last year, a number of key features have been introduced that make this, that really change the game for managing hybrid identities with Azure AD and Office 365. On the bottom in December, and then with an important update in April, Microsoft introduced AD Connect's capability to do seamless single sign-on. That is to use Kerberos to authenticate to Azure AD. And the other one is pass-through authentication. As a pass-through authentication might be an alternative for password syncing, where in the past you might have had to sync passwords into Azure AD, and maybe you weren't so comfortable about that. Well, now you don't have to. You can delegate authentication from Azure AD into on-premises Active Directory. We'll talk about identity protection as well as in the authentication management section. So why don't we get to it? I have to tell you that from my perspective, my presentation was a little long, so this section is quite light. But all I'm really going to do here is create some Active Directory users. If we have time at the end, I'll make some recommendations about things like ID fix and the fact that it's not going to help you completely, and there are things you need to do for on-premises prep. But for now, why don't we just create some Active Directory users? So I'm a big Sherlock Holmes fan. Anybody else watch Sherlock, the BBC thing? I'm totally into it, so that's my current fact. It was either that or it was going to be Doctor Strange. So you got, I don't know, would you prefer Doctor Strange? Okay, we'll see. All right. So we've just created some users, and then I kind of want to do the look, mono, hands thing and kind of point to you that if we go into Office 365 and we look at active users, and we look at users that are synced, there aren't any current users yet, okay? What I am going to do, and I'm telegraphing this a bit, is I'm going to begin my sync process to sync those users, and we'll start talking about what that means in a second, okay? But in the interest of time, I'll get that running. So here's our end game. All we've done so far for the on-prem prep is we've got some users in Active Directory. Nothing else has happened. Let's move to user management a little bit. Really, there are 3 options that we see organizations using to sync their identities or manage their identities in Azure AD. Azure AD being the identity subsystem for Office 365, it's really important that you get this right. The first one would be the old school method of using a traditional provisioning tool that actually goes and does create, update, deletes up into Azure AD. It doesn't use Active Directory in any way. You have a provisioning system and it goes and puts users in. The second mechanism, and the one that we're mostly seeing, is the use of Azure AD Connect, right? It's so many capabilities that we're going to talk about. I take 400 man-hours worth of client calls, and a lot of them is on Office 365. Virtually all of my clients are using Azure AD Connect to do their syncing. Finally, though, if you have an identity management as a service offering like Okta Centrify, you could use that mechanism as well. What we also see is the coupling of these two technologies, use of an identity governance and administration tool plus AD Connect. And the way that that comes together is really interesting. So with the governance tool, you'd get all the CRUD operations of managing users in Active Directory. So it's responsible for getting the users into AD. But then Azure AD Connect takes over. And what you'll see is that it will actually do the syncing and do the CRUD work within Azure AD. The benefit of this particular setup is you get all of those governance and compliance benefits of using your governance tool, like access certification, separation of duties, and then also you get the benefits of AD Connect, which just does a great job of syncing users. I know it's had some problems in the past. It's pretty stable. And then you get a whole other set of capabilities related to authentication, which we'll talk about. This is a big model, and I've talked to the Microsoft folks. They see this as well as a common deployment model. All right, so what I'd like to do now is configure Azure AD Connect and show you how mine is set up and get you a feel for how that actually works. Now, if you can't read that, I'll go through this. I'm going through the customized synchronization options of my Azure AD Connect. By the way, I'm running this all in my domain controller, so I'm running PowerPoint here and my PowerShell stuff and everything else. And so it asks for a so early I can't even talk and type at the same time. Give me a second, I'll work through that Starbucks cop, and then you won't be able to stop me. But essentially I'm logging in with an Azure AD user. It goes and verifies it. And here I'm saying, yep, sync my entire forest. That's my DNS domain, apiidentity.org. Don't try and take down my tenant, please. That's not very nice. And then I'm going to sync all my domains. But here, I'm going to do some filtering. So you can't read this, I bet, but there is a group, an Active Directory group called Azure Users. And so when I created the users with that PowerShell step, I put them in this group. Now what that means is that AD Connect is going to only synchronize users that are in the Azure Users group. Otherwise, it would be syncing all of the users in my forest, and I don't want to do that. I've picked a select number. So this is the way that this is one of the ways that you can selectively replicate users into Active Directory, Azure Active Directory. The last thing I'll point out to you in the bottom here, it's something called Directory Extension Attribute Sync. This will be super important when we start talking about license management. But what I've done is that I've told AD Connect, look, these 20 or so attributes that currently don't have any values here, and I'm sure you can't read that, but if I scroll down, there's all these extension attributes. I'm saying to Azure AD Connect, sync all of these too, please, because I'm going to be using them to do some group management and some license management within Azure Active Directory. And that's it. We'll let that run. It's going to do a sync afterwards as well, as you can see here. And given that I already did a sync already, I will show you that we looked here before. We had no Active Directory users. And we now have all of our Active Directory users in here. So Sherlock Holmes, Molly Hooper, Jim Moriarty, and so on, they're in the system. Step 2, this is where we are in terms of 4 best practices. We've created some users in the first step. They are in a group called Azure Users in Active Directory. AD Connect uses that group to filter which users get created within Azure AD. And at this point, we've shown you that they're already synchronized up. So we're two steps through. We've done on-premises prep, we've done user management, and let's go talk about license management. Now, before this group-based licensing thing came out in February, life was hard. I mean, it was really hard. You had to be the master of PowerShell, and you had to learn how to synchronize with users and groups between systems and so on. But since this group-based licensing mechanism came out in February, it changes the game completely. It's really, it's a good, strong feature set that answers a lot of the problems our clients are seeing. Now, when you do group-based licensing, two things need to happen. The first is somehow you need to get your AD users into the right Azure AD group, okay? And I'll show you how that happens. The second thing you need to do is set a policy that says, for these users in this group, we're going to apply this license, and I'll show you. So two steps, right? You've got to get the user in the right Azure AD group, and then you configure the group to apply a license automatically. Before this, you're in the business of either using Azure Automation and PowerShell workbooks, or you're using on-premises PowerShell scripts to do this stuff. No longer. So here, we sync the users. We sync them with those attributes. One of those attributes that the extra attributes that I had AD Connect Sync was something called, the value is Office 365 Premium. And so that becomes part of the user record within Azure AD. There's a match that happens, and I'll show you what that looks like, that puts the user in that group. And then group-based licensing takes over and says, yep, okay, that user needs access to this Office 365 SKU, and we'll disable these services as well. And then the user inherits those permissions from the system. Now, here's the challenge. A lot of people don't like modifying Active Directory users, right, to do this. This is a clean way to do this because it doesn't require any PowerShell. But if you wanted to use groups, you could do it that way too. You'd say, okay, I have an Office 365 group. Great, I'll put the users in there. And then what you're on the hook for is either using PowerShell or Graph API, you pick, that will synchronize these users from the on-premises Office 365 group into a static group that's called Office 365. So it's not dynamic. There's no way to read attributes and dynamically create the user in the group. And then group-based licensing takes over and you're on your way. So you have to decide. Are you okay with your benefits of going with attribute-based mechanisms as you don't have to do any PowerShell work? If you like to do it via groups and don't want to touch the user object, you're going to be in the business of doing probably PowerShell to make it work. All right, so let's go through some steps here. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip actually firing up ADUC, Active Directory users and computers, and show you those extended attributes. But trust me, every one of those users in there has got two attributes, one for the EMS license and one for the Office 365 license. But why don't we go take a look at some dynamic group membership rules within Azure AD to show how this works. Now here is the Office 365 group that I have, and you can see here that I've got all of the AD users. They are in there and they are in place, right? Let's figure out how they got there. The link is escaping me. Oh well. So you'll have to trust me that there was a good match on that attribute. Why don't we take a look at the, why don't we go take a look at some users and see how those licenses are applied. So if I go into Office 365 and I look at active users, and I'll just show you my AD synced users, and I go to Sherlock Holmes, you can see here that I'm about to take a look at some licenses. And because of those attributes that I used and dynamic group membership, I've actually set up the right licensing. Someone need to get that? But I've only enabled a couple of things here. Just really, in this case for EMS, I've enabled Office 365 Business Premium and Enterprise Mobility. So that was all the result of using extended attributes in Active Directory, having the dynamic group pick those up, put the user in the right dynamic group, and then assigning a license to it. And this is where we are at step 3 in license management. You've got some users. We use some extended attributes on the left-hand side in AD. And on the right-hand side, we have 2 groups, both dynamic groups, where the users have been assigned on the basis of those attributes, and they all have the right licenses to do their job. Let's take a look at the next area, which is authentication management. Like I said, we take an awful lot of calls. I also cover authentication for Gartner, and here are some of the questions we get. Stolen credentials for Exchange Online. How do we mitigate this? How do we make this happen and fix it? What should I use for MFA? Should I use a product like Ping Federate and its Ping ID capabilities? Should I use Duo Security? Should I use Azure AD? Which one? What are the benefits of those different things? And then finally, based on some of the recent introductions, how can I use these new tools like identity protection and conditional access to improve security and user experience? That's a fairly common number of inquiries we get. The top 3 authentication options among our clients are these 3. So one is to use AD Connect, and I'm going to explain to you the different ways that you can authenticate to Azure AD via AD Connect. The second one is Azure MFA, using the built-in MFA service built within Azure and Active Directory. And the last one is to use a third-party SAML identity provider, be it Okta, OneLogin, Ping Federate. And also, in many cases, because Azure MFA does a first authentication as a password typically, you frequently see clients coupling AD Connect with Azure MFA, and I'll show you that coming up in an example. So let's hit the different options that you can do for AD Connect authentication. The first one is the oldest one, where because Microsoft owns Azure AD and it owns Active Directory, well then it has access to the innards of these things and can take a password hash and protect it cryptographically and send it up into Azure AD. What that means is that when the user comes to authenticate to Azure AD, Azure AD takes care of all the authentication. There's nothing else happening. There's no calls down to the on-premises environment. And indeed, this method is required if you want to be able to use Azure VMs and Azure AD domain services as well. But here, the important aspect is the password is synced at admin time, not at runtime. And when the user authenticates, the authentication stops at Azure AD. Pass-through is one of the more recent ones that was introduced as well. This one is great if you don't like storing passwords, and there's no synchronization of the passwords at admin time. What happens is user connects, tries to authenticate to Azure AD, and then the password goes down through AD Connect to Active Directory, and Active Directory says, yeah, that's a good password, or no, it's not a good password. This is a great feature set, by the way, if you wanted to use Azure AD as a self-service password reset interface for Active Directory, because it helps with this as well. All right, let's take a look at one of the newer ones as well, which is AD Connect Seamless Single Sign-On, which if you're coming from a domain-joined device, you can use Kerberos. You can get single sign-on the basis of talking to Azure Active Directory. So in this case, I'm not doing anything weird with the workstation and the on-premises domain controller. I'm actually going to use those Kerberos tickets to authenticate to Azure AD and get single sign-on from the environment. And the demo that I have coming up will show you how to do that. Finally, you can use a third-party identity provider, which has some benefits as well. The way that works is a user's going to use a password, maybe it's against Active Directory, and then the user gets a SAML assertion, presents a SAML assertion to Azure AD, okay? And what happens then is Azure AD takes over as an OAuth authorization service and says, you need some OAuth tokens if you're trying to access Exchange Online. Here they are. Here's an access token, here's a refresh token. And then what happens is Office 365 functions as an OAuth resource service, and it consumes those tokens. Now, what can also happen too is, let's say you click on Outlook first, then you want to go to OneDrive for Business. You can use the refresh token from that you initially received for Outlook, and in fact get access to other services. Now, one of the nice things about this feature set as well is that whatever authentication mechanisms, be they adaptive, contextual, whatever flavor of the munch you want to use for MFA, as long as the SAML identity provider supports it, it will work with Azure AD, okay? One of the things that you need to realize is that when you're going to do Azure MFA as your selection choice, is that you can't use dynamic groups to have the users inherit the right attributes that they need to do MFA. So I'll give you an example. There are 2 attributes that you need to set on each user. They can't be set via a group. And so what most organizations are doing is they're using PowerShell They will either use PowerShell against a group on premises, an Active Directory group called MFA users, or they will actually use an Azure Active Directory group, and they'll sync the users into that and then run Azure Automation and a PowerShell workbook to do it. But the bottom line is, for those users that you want to use Azure MFA with, you've got to touch the user. You've got to modify the user attributes within Azure AD. Okay, conditional access. I think with the advent of Azure Identity Protection and conditional access, there are some really exciting things that can be done here. Not only if you play within just the Microsoft ecosystem, but if you actually play with third-party MFA as well. So conditional access has these two buckets. One of them is called access controls, which are the end results of things. I can enable access at the end of this policy, I can block access, or I can say a challenge with MFA. So maybe consider that a step-up scenario. And here you have assignments, which are all of these different things. I don't have the time to talk about them, but you can say based on a user or a group, you can say this application name or all enterprise applications or all mobile apps or all cloud apps, and then whether the device is joined to the environment or not, whether it's coming from a trusted IP address or not. And then at the bottom there, this is where Azure AD Identity Protection comes into play. And so one of the things you can look at is whether Azure AD Identity Protection says this is a high, medium, or low risk transaction. Well, what does that mean? If you look at identity protection, there's a high level, which means what Microsoft does is they have research teams that look for leaked credentials on the dark web. So if you're coming in with those credentials, they consider that a high risk transaction. The rest is about Microsoft doing an analysis, and if you think about all of the properties that Microsoft has online, they're processing 14 billion authentications per day, 800 million unique users, and 110 adaptive or contextual access points, and that's a reasonable number to assert. And then you have these medium and low level ones. I don't have time to go through them. They'll be in the slides. If you want to find me after, I can do that as well. All right. So before we actually go into the technical illustration of these things, this is what my environment looks like. So we have Azure AD Connect. It's configured for pass-through authentication and single sign-on. I'll show you. And then we have this conditional policy that I'll walk you through as well that's called off-premises MFA. And the result of the policy is that if you are coming from a domain joined workstation and you're coming from a trusted IP address, so both of those things need to be true, then you'll get single sign-on into Exchange Online. And then all the other users have to use MFA. Now, this conditional access policy works with not only Azure MFA, but it would work with, say, Ping Federate and Ping ID on premises, because MFA is expressed in the SAML assertion when the user actually authenticates to Azure AD. So conditional access can be aware of that and make a decision about MFA as well. In our environment, though, it's going to be focusing on Azure MFA. Well, great. So why don't we take a look, and I'll show you a couple things here. I want to show you how AD Connect is configured for pass-through authentication. So I'm going to the Change User Sign-In section, and once again, I log in. Oh, it's not even right. This is what happens when everyone watches you type. So you see here, if you can read it, I've configured it for pass-through authentication. I've configured it for single sign-on. All right, why don't we go take a look at this conditional access policy. So my conditional access policy is called off-premises MFA. And I've set one condition, and the condition is that if you are coming from a trusted IP, you are allowed access. Otherwise, you'll need to do MFA. That's the simple policy of it. It was pretty easy to set up and configure. Here's the result. So if you are not coming from a domain machine or a trusted IP, you'll need to use MFA. So why don't we actually take a look at what that might look like. I'm wrapping up, so I know we're approaching our time. So what I have is a Windows 10 machine here. It's running as a VM. The joys of doing a demo when the network isn't quite doing what it should. Well, I'll tell you what happens. How about that? And we'll pretend this is a screenplay walkthrough. What will happen is you will go, and because you're in the domain join workstation, you will in fact be able to get single sign-on, not only through Internet Explorer, Outlook clients, but also through Chrome. So you get seamless single sign-on from a domain trusted workstation with the right IP address. Now, if, let's say you were coming from a non-trusted IP address, like this is my laptop machine, so it's not part of the API domain, and I log in as John Watson. All right, so what I've left for you in the presentation is a couple of, you'll see this in the slides coming up, but I've got recommendations for you, so if you download them, we address most of these, but they're for each section on-premises and user management, and license management, and so on. So with that, I think we have a couple of moments for questions. Does anybody have any questions? Yes? I don't see that in play within Azure AD. I'm to be honest, I haven't tested that. So I don't know the role of WS Trust within that. And when I talk to our clients, I think they don't really talk about WS Trust anymore either. So I'd have to research that for you. I can get back to you.
The last part you were talking about the conditional access.
Yep.
Can you pass the attributes in a token, a security token, like a Confederate token?
Yes. So there is an MFA attribute that's set within the token from a third-party identity provider. So as you go through, within a conditional access environment, you will, it'll say, oh, you already did MFA. You're all set. So yes, it will respect that. So you can use third-party identity providers and others. Yes?
So Mark, how is that option for PTA from your clients and customers that you talk to? Fast authentication, how is customers adopting it?
How are they doing it?
Yeah.
Primarily today.
Is there a wider option, broader option for PTA?
So they're typically using password hash because Microsoft sort of told them to do that. But more and more of them are using password because they don't want to store the password hash. Right, good question. Anything else? I'll take one more. I'll be around, by the way, if you have other questions.
I noticed on one of your slides, you had your IGA tool wanted Active Directory for CRUD and then AD Connect for CRUD into Azure AD. Do you ever say to your clients, take their IGA tool and put it directly to Azure AD, not for CRUD, but maybe for Memphis?
No. And that's interesting. So no, we don't see a lot of people going against Active Directory, Azure AD natively with their IGA tool. The exception is if they're trying to do some sort of billing of licenses across different groups within the organization. There's a little more that you can do within an IGA setup than you could, but the vast majority of our clients are all using AD Connect. So, thank you so much. I'll be around. If you have any other questions, please let me know.